Welcome back to another episode of Weights and Wealth. This is the episode that we have to re-record after I made the error of not pressing record on the audio last weekend when we were recording. So hopefully we make it even better than last time. And we'll get started here with the shout out of the episode that we are going to start doing. This episode goes out to our listener Anne from Boston, Massachusetts. Anne asked us through Spotify, "Great episode, guys. I have 2 questions. What do you think of the macro bars for a quick breakfast? And is Nick really off caffeine?" Nick, would you like to answer the second question?
Well, no, I'm not. For those of you watching our podcast, I do have a cup of coffee today. No, but I did stop drinking caffeine for about a month or so. Caffeine's something that I kind of like to cycle a little bit. So I'll be drinking a cup, and then it'll go to 2 cups, 3 cups, 4. I think last summer, I was drinking way too much caffeine last summer. I was probably about 6 or 7 a day, which is not good. And then I decided to cut it out completely. But now I'm having 1 or 2 cups.
Yeah, so Nick and I both do this where we'll slowly drink more and more coffee, and then we both like to just cut it cold turkey and go off of caffeine, let our tolerance come back down, not have to rely on a drug and build that mental toughness, I guess, and then we'll introduce coffee again and start to cycle all over again. So Nick was off of coffee for about a month, and good job to Nick.
Thank you.
Getting off drugs. The first question that Anne had was about macro bars for breakfast. I looked up macro bars. As far as granola bars go, or energy bar, protein bar, fill in the blank, they look pretty good. All organic ingredients, pretty small ingredient list, no really red flags. And as far as the macros go, there's 10 grams of protein for 270 calories, which is, somewhere between 16 and 20% protein. So that's pretty good, but if you're only having 1 macro bar, you're only getting 10 grams of protein for your breakfast. And as we've said before, you want to try to get a high protein breakfast in the morning when you're getting up. Having a high protein breakfast will help you stay on track with trying to get 0.8 to 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, and it will also help stabilize your blood sugar levels throughout the rest of the day, and it will help reduce your leptin and ghrelin hormone levels, hormones that lead to you not feeling full or lead to cravings. So starting the day with a high protein breakfast, these studies that look at different factors, when you pull them all together, it's a big key to success that anyone can start off with as just a basic step to improving your health and your fitness. So my suggestion to Anne would be, if you're having a macro bar for breakfast, to maybe just add a protein shake, a scoop of protein and water with that, and get up to 30 to 40 grams of protein for your breakfast by doing that. But we always recommend whole foods here for your diet, but we understand that sometimes convenience is important, and if you're going with a macro bar, it's not bad compared to a lot of other bars out there, but just try to get that protein up.
Yeah, and if you're not eating whole foods in the morning, just going as minimally processed as possible. I looked up the ingredients list for these macro bars. They're not super long. So some of your protein bars out there have a novel on the back of the wrapper. And a lot of this stuff, I just don't know what it is. And it's best to not be putting that in your body. I know when I was in high school, I thought, protein bar has protein, it's healthy. But that's really not the case. A lot of them are just like candy bars.
Basically, yeah. But yeah, thank you, Anne. This episode is going out to you, and thank you for asking questions, and keep the questions coming to our different inboxes that we have set up, please. ChatGPT has been talked about a lot. A lot of people have been talking about how it's going to change different industries and how jobs are going to be lost and it'll create new jobs. For anyone that doesn't know, ChatGPT is an AI bot that essentially it's kind of like a Google, I guess. You can, on its website, you can type anything in and it will give you an answer. It will write a paper for you, it will write code for you. You can ask it anything and it will pull from all over the internet. And I think it reached like 1 million viewers or 1 million users in 5 days.
Yeah, I think it was the fastest website to reach 1 million users, quicker than any social media like Facebook, YouTube, anything like that.
Was TikTok the previous record holder? Like 72 days or something?
I don't know. I think it was TikTok. I don't remember off the top of my head, but yeah, ChatGPT, as soon as it launched, it just absolutely blew up.
Yeah. A lot of people have been talking about how it's going to change things, but what Nick and I were talking about the other morning when we were doing our cold plunge was how maybe it's not a good thing. We feel like Luddites, for anyone that doesn't know, the Luddites were a group of, I guess you could call them like terrorists in Great Britain back in the 1800s during the Industrial Revolution. They tried to like attack textile mills and prevent, I think, the sewing machines from changing everyone working by hand in these textile mills to having these automated machines come in and take away jobs. But Nick and I were talking about how we kind of feel like Luddites with how maybe ChatGPT isn't necessarily a great thing in terms of people will just think they don't have to learn things and they can just get the answer to everything online. But that's pretty dangerous because I just, as we've seen from the past couple of years, relying on what the science is or what the establishment on most websites might say the answers to something is not the answer. But if people think that there's this all-knowing AI that can tell them the answer, that could be pretty dangerous.
Yeah, and I think people are starting to adapt to it already. I know I was talking to my sisters. I have 2 sisters in high school, and they already have to write their essays in class ever since this thing launched.
Back to pencil and paper.
Right. Which I remember doing that in high school too, and that it just makes you think very, very quickly.
Yeah, because the amount of writing you have to do, you have to think quicker than when you're typing your paper out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And another thing, I wonder if human created content is just going to plummet. I mean, I was just playing around with it last night, and I wanted to just see if I could create this Twitter persona. And I gave it, a bunch of adjectives about how I wanted to sound, who my target audience was. And it just started pumping out a bunch of tweets on a bunch of different topics. And there's really not going to be much human thought.
Are you saying podcast W&W on Twitter is going to be all AI tweets?
I might throw one in here and there just to see how they do compared to what I can come up with myself.
Tweets aren't that long, so I feel like it might even be faster to just write out your thought on Twitter than to go to ChatGPT and try to...
The ones it was coming up with were very good. I mean, they were like very thought-provoking.
Mm-hmm. Crazy.
So, and yeah.
Moving on from AI and ChatGPT, today we're going to be talking about addiction and just how our current culture makes people rely on dopamine rushes and how it can be a really good thing if you can learn to avoid overloading your body on dopamine and learning how to restrict yourself in different areas.
Yeah, so addictions are at an all-time high right now from anything from, drugs, porn, smartphone addiction, eating, consumer spending, and the pandemic kind of catapulted it a little bit. People were stuck in their homes, didn't have much else to do, couldn't go to the gym, a lot of cases couldn't go outside. and they just turned to all these things that gave them a quick rush of dopamine. It's all about instant gratification, and we know that that's generally not very good. You want to do something that you have to work hard towards, and that's kind of the purpose of dopamine, is to give you motivation.
Yeah, and when you get a big dopamine rush from, say we're talking about the screens, and if you binge Netflix and sit on the couch all day, you might feel good while you're doing the binging, but then afterwards you feel like crap, right? And that's one of the weird things about dopamine. If you read Dopamine Nation, Dr. Anna Lembke, she talks about how dopamine you can think of as a seesaw, right? So if you feel pleasure from doing something that releases a lot of dopamine, seesaw comes down on the pleasure side, but dopamine always balances itself out, and then the pain side of the seesaw winds up coming down afterwards. So whenever you do something that gives you a huge dopamine rush, you're gonna come down on the other side of it feeling like crap sometimes. That's sometimes why when you achieve a goal or something, afterwards you might not feel great. It feels really good in the moment when you achieve your goal, but then you kind of come down from that high.
Yeah, I know Dr. Andrew Huberman talks a lot about dopamine in his podcast too, and he's always talking about how your brain is comparing levels of dopamine. So when it's really high, you're feeling good, and then it might come back to your baseline, which is what you're normally at. But since it's lower compared to what it just was, you feel worse.
Yeah, and if you have like a high baseline by constantly consuming really good tasting food and constantly getting dopamine hits from being on your phone and seeing the likes on social media and all these different things. You mentioned pornography and alcohol, all these different things that give your brain dopamine rushes, that's going to elevate your baseline. And then when you do things that would normally feel good and give you dopamine rush, it's not really going to register compared to your baseline. So everyday things that might normally give humans joy or pleasure, I guess, it's not going to register as much when your baseline dopamine level is already high. So then in order to be happy and content with things in your life, everything kind of needs to be more extreme in terms of your different senses.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of anecdotally attribute this to the rise of depression and anxiety. Just the fact that people aren't happy with doing the things throughout their daily life that in the past we have been. Just because we have all these things that create huge dopamine rushes, and they are created to give you a dopamine rush. Like, the people creating these products know what they're doing. They know how to make things addictive, and to get people coming back. That's why our food has so much sugar and fat. You know, these like the smartphones, there's always things popping up at you. If you watch TikTok, the camera angle is changing every half a second, and that's to keep you engaged.
Yeah.
It gives you a dopamine rush, for lack of a better term, every time that the screen angle changes. And what it does is it just keeps you watching and wanting to come back for more.
My sister Katie and I had a conversation about the quick camera change angle, which we also do here. We had a conversation about that as far as when I was with my niece and nephew. They were watching this thing. It's a YouTube series with this guy that wears blue and orange. I can't remember his name. It's something like Mr. Tibley or something like that. I know that's not it, but it's basically this kids show that this guy launched on YouTube and then sold for millions of dollars, but it's super fast cuts and camera angles, and it's sped up as he runs around. And my sister Katie and I were talking about contrasting that with Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, how he would just like sit there and everything was very slow, and just the difference in what that does to kids' brains, and also like the rise of ADHD and ADD, how of course kids can't pay attention. Our focus is constantly being hammered into these little 5, 10, 15-second time frames. Of course people can't sit down and read a book or just even sit around and not check their phone. Like, people always have to be doing something. When was the last time you just sat down for 15 minutes and didn't do anything, just kind of sat there and either thought alone to yourself or meditated or sat in prayer? This is something that I do with my clients a lot, is I'll try to get them, if they are really stressed, part of creating adaptation for a reverse diet is getting rid of some stress in your life. So oftentimes I might implement with my clients, hey, we're going to shoot for, maybe we start at 10 minutes a day of a de-stressing activity where you're either going on a walk without your phone or meditating or sitting in prayer. Just these different parasympathetic nervous system stimulating activities that are going to help you de-stress and get into like a restful state. I feel like today, with phones and screens and our busy lifestyles, people really struggle with this.
Yeah, and it is kind of hard to force yourself to, and it feels weird at first, just sitting in silence, not doing anything. And that's one of the things, like, I try to meditate. I've done it a few times, and just keep your mind blank. Your mind wants to wander, but it's kind of nice just to bring it back and try not to think about anything. And it feels good afterwards. It does. And it's something that I've been trying to work in a lot more, just to lower my own stress. And that's also something I know on our interview with Katie, I mentioned that I was going to a naturopathic doctor, and that was something that she really tried to help me with, was lowering my stress. She gave me I don't know what was in it. I know ashwagandha was in it, but some sort of herb to help me, because I wasn't sleeping much at the time.
Yeah.
So to help me sleep better, lower my cortisol levels. And I think we should do a podcast on stress sometime.
We should do that.
Yeah, full episode on stress, because it does impact all areas of your life, from
Absolutely.
Your finances to your health and so on.
Magnesium may have been in the whatever pill or whatever that she gave you. In one of the episodes, we went over all the different nutrient deficiencies that people have, and the amount of people with magnesium deficiencies is huge. So if you struggle with sleep and you're really stressed, of course we always encourage blood work and getting labs done to see what you're deficient in before you start taking things. But magnesium, especially in the form magnesium threonate before bed, I take it if my sleep is kind of going downhill, and it definitely helps me sleep better, which leads to being less stressed. I think one of the lines that we can draw here with these addictive dopamine activities is, you may have heard before that when you don't sleep well or you don't get a lot of sleep, you're much more prone to eating junk food and making bad food choices, because your body feels that it's stressed and it wants calories. Because for hundreds of thousands of years, if you were super stressed, it was often because you didn't have access to food. So one of the first things our body resorts to is craving these high calorie foods when we're stressed and we don't have a lot of sleep. So I think that doesn't just apply to food. I think it applies to all these addictions, where when you're stressed and you have low sleep, you're more prone to fall prey to screen time, overeating, overspending, alcohol, all these different things that we're talking about here today.
Yeah, and the hard part is that can kind of fall into a vicious cycle where you'll be stressed and then you'll turn to one of these bad behaviors. You'll start going on your phone.
A, kind of feel bad about yourself, and B, it'll also kind of make you more stressed and just lead you to kind of turn to that in the future.
What do you eat when you binge Netflix all day?
Right, you're eating like potato
downward
chips or
spiral.
ice cream or...
And then also, like, the reverse of that is when people start going to the gym, they naturally improve their diet because they know that they don't want their efforts to be wasted, right? So they naturally start improving their diet when they go to the gym, or vice versa. If they start cleaning up their diet, they're more likely to also then go to the gym. So a lot of these behaviors kind of clump together a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it kind of shows the power of habit too. I don't know if you could call it an addiction, but just having a routine that you do every day, it just becomes a lot easier once you start doing it every day. You know, waking up at the same time, going right to the gym, going to work, and then having something semi-productive in the evening, whether it be, you know, even just de-stressing, I would consider that productive. But just having, you know, like a set schedule kind of.
Absolutely. And I think the evenings here is where you can really set yourself up for success if you already have that morning routine in place. Because if you come home from work and you fall into that Netflix kind of lifestyle post-work, like most Americans who watch, 2 hours of TV a day, I think, or something like that. If you're able to instead use some of that time to read or do something productive with a side hustle, or like most people, just spend time with your family if you're a parent or if you have a spouse, using that time to do something productive that's not one of these stressful behaviors that we're talking about is going to set you up for success with clumping the good behaviors together.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we had written down in our notes here today is the obesity rate is at 42% in America right now. That is so shockingly high, and one of the reasons is just the overconsumption of processed foods. In episode 1 of Weight and Wealth, we went over how about 60% of the diet in America is these processed foods for the average person. So the overconsumption of foods solely for taste is one of the ways that people get obese, right? If you can learn to eat foods for how they make you feel, for how they're gonna fuel your body, that's gonna help you not only get into better shape, but it's also going to help you lower that baseline dopamine that we talked about. If you're eating foods for how they nourish your body instead of just for the pleasure and the taste, you're going to lower those dopamine levels, because when you eat sugar, your dopamine levels spike. That's one way you can get a dopamine hit. So throughout these different categories we're going to hit on here, there's different ways that you can get rid of these unnecessary, I guess you could say, dopamine spikes that are just increasing your baseline dopamine level day to day.
Yeah, and another thing that has spiked recently is consumer spending. I think, what was it, since the third quarter in 2020, consumer spending has risen every single quarter, and that's something else that gives people a rush, kind of. I don't have that per se. I don't really get that much satisfaction from buying from buying something.
Well, we're men,
But,
you know,
yeah,
women do all the time.
But I mean, there are other things that I struggle with. You know, I recently quit nicotine. I don't know
There
if
you
I
go.
told you that. It's been a full month now, so I finally don't have cravings anymore.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But yeah, consumer spending, people, you do get a dopamine hit from spending money and buying nice things, and that's just something that is better to avoid for your wallet.
Yeah, I mean, just the impact that not shopping to make yourself feel better has on your wallet is reason enough to do it, even without the dopamine side of things that we're talking about here today. And also the increase in consumer spending, I think, would be normal to see just because GDP grows over time. That's why we recommend, even though we don't give financial advice or investing advice, we recommend investing in index funds that just kind of trail the S&P that almost always increases over a general long time frame, right? So that would be normal to see, but with the recession that we're in, or that some people say we're going to go in, you would think that consumer spending would come down and people would want to be saving money, but it's the opposite. The savings rate has been going down, and the amount of savings that people have has been going down, while consumer spending and credit card debt has been going up. And some people might say we're not in a recession. If you listen to our friends Chris and Saeed at the Higher Standard, they say that 2 quarters of negative GDP would be a recession. That's how it's always been until the White House said that's not what makes a recession anymore. But likely since January 2022, if you look at what the definition of a recession has always been, we've technically been in a recession since January 2022, but we've still seen this increase in spending.
Yeah, and kind of on that, this kind of goes into a little segue, but the part that's weird to me is that unemployment is really low, but so is the labor force participation rate. So I don't really understand how people are spending higher amounts while fewer people are working. Just kind of weird to me.
Credit card debt has been going up, so that could be part of it. Also, with where we are as far as people getting money through the government, it started with the welfare state, Great Society, Lyndon B. Johnson, what was that, 60s? Yeah, that would have been right after JFK, so 1965 maybe, Great Society. Just the explosion of the welfare state. Not that welfare isn't a good thing and helps a lot of people and is needed for our society to function well and to help people out when they fall in bad times, but just this explosion of people getting money from the government that increased even more during COVID with the stimulus checks people were getting. People are able to just spend money that they don't have, and America has for 100 years been a very credit spending focused society, which you don't really see in other countries. In Europe or in the Middle East, people don't really spend through credit like we do here in America.
Yeah, and one thing on welfare is that it has its place, and I personally believe that there is a need for it, but it has to be used well, and it can't be overused because then it kind of keeps people in poverty. And I'm not sure if you saw this, but in San Francisco, they're voting on giving African Americans $5 million each.
Yep.
Which talk about debt and spending on credit. Yeah.
So that's also interesting because Dennis Prager, I heard him say a statistic. I have to fact check this, so maybe we'll do that in post-production if you're watching, but he said that 360,000 Africans were brought to America through the transatlantic slave trade. And that since then, 3 million Africans have chosen to immigrate to America. So the argument for reparations for San Francisco, these payments, doesn't fully make sense if you look at it logically with the amount of Africans that got forced and were traded over here through the slave trade, which was absolutely terrible, compared to the almost, 9 times greater amount of Africans that immigrated here. So it's kind of like an emotional argument, and whenever we're looking at government policy, we want to take emotion out of it. So that's interesting to think about with San Francisco there.
Yeah, I mean, I personally will be very surprised if something like that passes. I mean, $5 million is a huge sum of money to give to every single person. I don't even know how they have a tax base that's large enough to provide that.
Well, California is in a deficit right now. They lost their surplus that they had, I think, during COVID. So yeah, they don't have the money to do it. But
well,
all right. The next thing that we were going to talk about was
yes. So to the topic of porn, it's a very touchy subject for a lot of people. A lot of opinions both ways. It's something that's kind of hard to be talked about. It's a little bit taboo.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's not something that really comes up in conversation. But it's something that I really think does need to be talked about because it can be very harmful. Ted, do you know when the average age that a boy is exposed to pornography?
I'd have to guess when they're a teenager and they start going through puberty. So 14,
12, which kind of blows my mind a little bit. It's called adult entertainment. I think that's a bit of a euphemism. But yeah, and it can really affect your psychological state.
Yeah, I think especially since our audience is young men here, it's not a good idea to watch it. You shouldn't be watching it. I think it's kind of gross personally. Like I think it's a very beta thing to do to like watch other people. So young men out there, maybe just think about that. Also, like we were talking about with the dopamine rush that you get from something like that, since males are very visual, it's gonna raise your baseline. And then I think you had a stat about erectile dysfunction on here. I know that erectile dysfunction among like 20 to 30-year-olds has increased drastically over the past, I don't know, couple of decades, but that just speaks to how accessible it is. I personally know some guys in their 20s that struggle with ED, and it's crazy to me that they've been so overstimulated to the point that they can't even like naturally
and
do what they want to do.
I know I talked about him earlier, but Dr. Andrew Huberman, he talks about this as well. I'm a huge fan of this podcast, if you can't tell. But he was kind of talking about how, especially if you start watching porn before you have sex, your mind kind of shifts to observing the act rather than actually participating in it. So that is sort of an explanation for why some people think it can induce ED.
Okay. It just kind of rewires the brain to like be visual instead of feeling. Is that
right? Yeah. Because there are so many different parts of sex that are not visual, and it kind of rewires the brain to be purely visual. But now it is just a correlation. The ED could be coming from something else. We don't know for sure. I mean, testosterone levels are also very low.
That's true. Yeah. It's kind of like what we talked about earlier with anxiety and depression and screen use, right? If you read, just going to plug another book here, if you read iGen or The Coddling of the American Mind, which is by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, they go into all the statistics with the dawn of the iPhone coming out, and how anxiety and depression have increased, and the sharp increase, especially for teenage girls with anxiety and depression, since social media was really introduced like around 2013, and just how much the increase in anxiety and depression lines up with those two dates. So it's correlation, just like that, not causation, and that's always a very important distinction. But I think anytime that there's a correlation, there's something that you can look at. I did a post once on how there's a very weird correlation where the amount of kids that drown in pools correlates almost perfectly with the amount of movies that Nicolas Cage was in that year.
Yeah.
It's a very strange correlation. Obviously, no causation. So that's the difference between correlation and causation. But when there is a correlation between two things that are linked in some way, there's always something that you can maybe look into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and kind of on that Nicolas Cage topic, I know that there's a website out there that has a bunch of these really weird correlations. I forget the name of it, but it is fun to kind of scroll through. And
I think the book Freakonomics might be about different correlations like that, but I could be wrong. Haven't read it yet. It's just sitting on my bookshelf.
I haven't read that. Is that related to the podcast?
Mm-mm.
No.
Oh, is there a Freakonomics podcast?
I think so.
Oh,
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
probably. Yeah.
Okay.
Podcasts, books.
Yeah.
You have been reading a lot more though lately, right?
I've been trying to. Yeah, it's something that it's a habit that I really want to develop. I haven't been able to yet, but I've been working at it. I've been reading this book called Brainwash recently, which goes very well with what we've been talking about today. It kind of talks about all the different addictions that we have to food and our phones. Those are like the two big things that it really hits, and just talks about how it affects all these areas of our life. But yeah, I have been trying to read more. Back to your question.
That's good. I always feel good when I sit down and read for a period of time. It makes me feel a lot better afterwards than if I were to watch something on Netflix, Disney, whatever. And also for me to restrict myself from watching TV, I don't actually have a TV and I don't have access to streaming services aside from Discovery, so I can watch Chopped while I cook. But doing that helps me not really have the option to watch things. So creating barriers for yourself if you struggle with any of these things, I think is a good way to force yourself into a habit. And then once you have the habit of replacing maybe one of these behaviors that is a dopamine rush centered behavior, replacing that with a habit, and then once you have that habit, you can remove the barrier and still have the habit and probably not fall into these traps. So that's something I'll do with clients sometimes as a trainer is I'll tell them to reduce access to some of these highly processed foods in their house, and then if they do want ice cream or cookies or something, they can go out to the store and get it, but that's a barrier, right? So it's not like, hey, you have to eat whole foods, right? But you can eat those other things, just create some sort of barrier to reduce access if you struggle with overeating those foods.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how I quit nicotine. Like, it's a lot easier to make the decision once not to go to the store and buy something than it is to always have on hand right next to you. And then you have to be constantly making that choice to not indulge in something.
Definitely. If you like this episode and want to learn more about this topic, we went over some resources, I guess. We talked about Dopamine Nation, a book by Dr. Anna Lembke. We talked about Andrew Huberman's podcast. Do you remember what it's called?
I think it's Huberman Lab.
Huberman Lab, yep. That's a really good podcast for anything scientific with light or the brain or neuroscience. And then we talked about The Coddling of the American Mind, another book by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, I think.
We had
And your book,
Brainwash. I don't remember. I know there are two authors. It was a father and a son. I don't remember their names. I can find that though.
All right, we'll link it in the show notes. And if you're ever looking for anything that we talked about, whether it's an article or a statistic or a study, if you're on Spotify or Apple Music or YouTube or whatever you're on, we'll usually have like a paragraph about the show in the comments, and then all the timestamps so you can jump to wherever you want. And then if you go to our website, we'll have those same show notes, but we'll also have all of our citations. So if you're ever looking for any of those facts or statistics or articles or studies or whatever, that's where they are. They're on our website. You can just go to the show notes tab. And if you've been enjoying Weights and Wealth, please give us a 5-star review or share it with your friends or follow us on social media and share our little clips and help us grow.
Yeah, please give us a follow on Twitter specifically. I'm running that account. We have 3 followers right now. I feel like I'm just posting into the void and no one's actually seeing it.
Nick runs the Twitter and the TikTok. So if you're on social media and you're talking to someone for Twitter or TikTok, it's Nick. For Instagram, my fiance Alex runs that. So you'll usually get her. I also sometimes log in here and there, so you might get me. And
you might get some stories of us working out at Big Work.
Thanks for staying with us, and let us know what this episode made you think about. All right, we'll see you next time.